What is up, Twisty Throttlers? I just got back from a 3-day, 1,300-mile road trip through the Canadian Rockies on my 1985 Honda Goldwing. I rolled through Nelson, Revelstoke, Golden, Lake Louise, Banff, and Canmore, to name a few. I also lined up some pretty unique lodging accommodations that had me soaking in a wood fire hot tub one night and sharing a 14-bunk hostel the next. The weather was trying, the scenery outstanding, and the experience unforgettable. This ride was especially important to me because it was the first long ride back on the Goldwing since I blew the head gasket on my 4-day, 1,400-mile road trip to Reno, Nevada earlier this year. I documented both the trip and the head gasket repair with videos you can find on my page. I've logged a lot of miles on this bike. I've done a handful of multiple-day rides through remote and rugged terrain of Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. On one trip through Montana, I spent the entire day riding on dirt with this highway princess and blind confidence in its ability to get me home. Since the blown head gasket, I've dealt with another electrical problem that left me stranded at the grocery store. And after years of worry-free, reliable travel with my classic motorcycle, I was feeling untrustworthy in its ability to keep me on time and on the road. I think when most people get that feeling, it's quickly followed up with a for sale sign. In fact, I'm almost certain that's how this amazing machine landed in my possession, but that's another story altogether. I love this bike, I believe in it, and I'm also confident in my ability to keep it checking off miles down the road. I knew the only way to shake my confidence in its reliability was to complete another multiple-day run. With a 6-month-old in the house now, those opportunities are further and farther between. When my wife decided to run our newborn to see the grandparents in Central Washington, I jumped at the opportunity for a 3-day Canadian Rockies tour. With only a week of planning, I didn't complete as much research as I normally would have, but I set a route, reserved the lodging, and literally prayed my machine would carry me through. My plan, if it hadn't, would have been to leave it on the side of the road, hitchhike back stateside, and probably post it on Marketplace for free with a promise to send the title to whomever could prove they were able to get it home. It's not like I don't have friends. Unbeknownst to my wife, I do have friends. But when you're 35, it's difficult to find the time in the day to catch lunch, let alone ask your buddy to drive 8 hours across an international border in a pickup truck and trailer to come get you and your 40-year-old motorcycle on a Wednesday. Trust me, if the bike had broken down, getting it home would have been the least of my worries. And I would have needed those 8 hours to contemplate explaining to my wife, 1, why I do these things I do, and 2, why I was getting home late to help with our newborn baby boy. And the fact that I was traveling a day's drive from home on a 40-year-old motorcycle, which is broken down and left me stranded twice in the last 6 months, would have somehow needed to be resolved. Long story short, I needed this ride, I got this ride, and we're leaving Spokane, Washington to the north at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday in August. The overall target of this trip, if I had to explain it to someone who does not ride motorcycles, is that I went to Banff. Because if you don't ride motorcycles, then you drive car. And in a car, it's not the route that matters, but the destination. On my motorcycle, the frame is removed. And every second of those 3 days, I was exactly where I wanted to be. On a road, on my motorcycle, heading to, through, or from the Canadian Rocky Mountains. Because the route is more important than the destination on a motorcycle, I will go to lengths to avoid an out-and-back trip. For this reason, I chose to leave Spokane to the northwest through Chewelah, Colville, and Northport, crossing the U.S.-Canadian border at the smaller boundary crossing, and working my way up through Fruitvale to the first intentional stop in Nelson. This route avoids the more major highways and is comprised of slower, more curvy roads with smaller, less documented intersections. Completely preferable for a self-guided, itinerary-free 3 days like I'd planned. But what I didn't know was that my cell phone was going to stop working once I crossed the border. No calls, no messaging, no GPS. and maybe worst of all, no music. This normally would have not been as big of a deal for me, but I was on a tight schedule this first day. I knew I had about 8.5 hours of drive time to get where I planned to be this evening. Adding in time for fuel, food, inclement weather, and a wait for the ferry would not have left me much time for any wrong turns or jaunts in the opposite direction. Not even to mention my wife not being able to get a text or a call through to me, and what I would need to do had anything gone wrong. I made my first intentional stop in Nelson, British Columbia. Where I come from, Nelson is a big deal. If you want to plan a trip to Canada and not much more, you can hop across the border and within an hour be able to spend a night or two enjoying the favorable exchange rate. I believe Nelson is kind of known as a tourist party town, and before the legalization of marijuana, it was a hot spot for growers and distribution. I hadn't been through this area since I was probably 10, so it was nice to check it out, grab a sandwich, and utilize the cafe's free Wi-Fi to send a couple messages to my wife and figure out how to get to the ferry in Galena. I found out if I started a route on Wi-Fi on my phone and didn't close the directions, it would leave me a blue line to follow on my phone. No information beyond that, but as long as I was able to follow that blue line and pick up some Wi-Fi at each of my destinations, I should be able to make it to my lodging. I headed out of Nelson to the east, following the north side of Foster Creek onto the west side of the Kootenay Lake, past Ainsworth Hot Springs and on my way to Kelso. The weather at this point of the trip was intermittent, with glimpses of sunshine between the mostly cloudy sky and trickles of light rain. It happened to be my luck that these 3 days I had planned to be in BC and Alberta were probably the single worst days of the summer, with plans to brighten and heat up with my departure to the south. After a quick refill in Kelso, I branched off of the 31 and onto the 31A to the west, which would carry me over the mountains from Kootenay Lake to Slocum Lake. On the way up over the mountain pass, the weather looked promising. The sky was clear, and I actually hit a dry patch of road. But as I crested the mountain pass, some of the worst weather I have dealt with on the Honda ensued. Heavy rain, hail, and thunder plagued me down the mountain pass all the way from New Denver and halfway up the ferry to Galena. I contemplated pulling over at Bear Lake after turning a bend in the road covered in hail. I kept both wheels moving forward at a comfortable pace, hoping to press out of the weather and into some sunshine. The bike handled extremely well given the conditions. I don't believe you can really train for riding in the rain, but the best thing to do is to get some wet roads under your belt at a speed you're comfortable with. Aside from the low visibility, the motorcycle hardly noticed the rain, with no reduced traction at the speeds I was traveling at. If you're open to accepting any recommendations from me, I'd suggest riding a bit more cautious, but also as if the rain were not even there. I feel like more accidents happen in the rain due to working it up in your head or the poor visibility, rather than the reduced traction from the rain. The hardest part for me is getting over the thought of slipping out, which can lead to some poor decisions while riding. Overall, the bike handled great, and I was thankful for the layer of Rain-X I applied to the windscreen before leaving the garage. Getting off of the 31A at New Denver, I hopped on the 6 North to catch the ferry out of Galena and across Slocum Lake. A break in the weather was extremely appreciated, knowing I still had a few hundred miles to ride under my best assumption. With no GPS, I really didn't have a clue. All I knew at that point was I needed to go north to the ferry, across the lake, up to Revelstoke, and east to Golden. From the bunched up traffic coming the opposite direction, I knew that I'd probably miss the ferry. The Galena to Shelter Bay ferry runs approximately every hour and is considered part of the highway and free to its riders. I ended up waiting a bit over a half an hour for the ferry and took in some views before hopping on for the half-hour ride across the lake and heading north to Revelstoke. I was luckily one of the first off the boat and near the front with some people that were in a lot more of a hurry than I was. With the time I lost to the storm, I figured it was wise to try to stick with them as my rabbit in case the Canadians like enforcing the speed limit. I really don't want to deal with a headache like that. From what I hear about their taxes, I doubt their speeding tickets are very affordable. I made Revelstoke my second Canadian fuel stop. I usually keep good track of my miles and fuel consumption and miles per gallon to ensure nothing funky is going on with the carbs. Fuel consumption can be a good indication of that, but once the volume got flipped to liters, all that was out the window. I really have no idea how many liters are in a gallon, but I know that it's more than one. After finding the Starbucks to be closed in Revelstoke, I gave up on internet and hoped my memory was going to serve me right. I should be able to hop on to the Trans-Canadian Highway number 1 to the east, which should take me directly to Golden, BC. The increased speed limit of the interstate was appreciated, and the view of the mountain ranges was fantastic. I really hope to make it back up this way in the winter for some snowmobiling. Revelstoke's the mecca of North America for snowmobiling. After nearly 12 hours on the road, I made it to my first night stay and my elevated camping experience at Camp Moose Trail outside of Golden, BC. I kind of booked this place on a whim, not really knowing what to expect and hoping it wasn't like the Fire Festival. I could not have been more blown away with my experience. Mike was an excellent host, the facilities were top-notch, and I left after having some of the best pancakes I've ever had. Camp Moose Trail offers an elevated camping experience. Each guest stays in their own white canvas tent with their own fireplace and queen-size bed equipped with one of the nicest comforters I've ever had the pleasure of sleeping under. There's an outdoor communal area with fireplace, benches, rock climbing wall, and pizza oven. There's also the option of cooking your own food in the tent dining room brunch area. What I was really excited for was the wood fire hot tub, and it did not disappoint. After a day like I had had, it was exactly what I needed and warm enough for even the most chilled of adventurers. Mike said he's been running this place for 4 years now, and although it comes with many challenges, he feels like he's getting everything dialed in, and I agree. My tent was extremely cozy. It rained the entire night, and I slept like a baby in my comfortable bed and amazing duvet as the rain piled down and the fireplace crackled away. I left for my adventure through the Canadian Rocky Mountains only after having some of the best pancakes I've ever had. Maybe it was the longitudinal location, but Mike assures me that he's developed quite the technique over the last 4 years. From the opportunity of a good night's rest and all my clothes dried out on the fireplace, I was more than ready to hit the road and cross over from British Columbia into Alberta, Canada, and explore the national parks of the Canadian Rocky Mountains. After a loop through Golden, BC, and a quick oil check, I continued east on the Trans-Canadian Highway from Golden, BC into the Yoho National Forest, with the makings of what could be an amazing day of motorcycling. The mountain pass from Golden through Yoho elevated me 2,500 feet and provided some of the best scenery on this trip yet. After the hard press the day before, making as few and as short of stops as possible, I was excited for a day of meandering through the highways, side roads, and sights of Banff National Park. On the 56-mile ride from Golden to Lake Louise, I took the opportunity to hop off the interstate and cruise through some of the smaller towns to get a feel for what everyday life is like in the northern Rockies. My first stop within Banff National Park was the glacier-fed Lake Louise. Known for its turquoise colors water, ringed by high mountain peaks, and overlooked by an impressive chateau, it is one of the most famous mountain vistas in the world. Given its high prestige, as you can imagine, this place is overrun. There are far more people than I would normally prefer. Traffic and parking look to be a nightmare. But with a motorcycle, I was given preferred parking, and I didn't have more than a few minutes walk down to the vista. If you come by Lake Louise, I would encourage you to brave the chaos and dysfunction of the parking and crowds for a few minutes of taking in the absolutely amazing sight. Very seldomly is there the opportunity to live within a masterpiece, and the views from the shores of Lake Louise are nothing short of that. Humbled by the views of Lake Louise, I was ready to break from the crowds and add some miles to the voyage. It was a nice surprise to see a couple other adventurers had joined me in the parking lot with an aptitude of proper parking. After fueling up and taking advantage of the Wi-Fi, I was off to explore the offerings of the Ice Road Parkway. Icefields Parkway. Prepare to be amazed. The Icefields Parkway, or Alberta Highway 93, is a 150-mile stretch of road which traverses the Continental Divide through the soaring Rocky Mountain peaks, ice fields, and vast sweeping valleys. I performed no research on this stretch of road, and although Google Maps had the road marked as closed, I was especially thankful to find it open, as it became the absolute surprise highlight of the trip, as well as one of my biggest regrets not to have allocated more time to making the entire out and back trip, which could be a blessing in disguise, as it gives me a rock-solid excuse to make this trip again. Since completing my trip, I've learned there are over 100 glaciers along the parkway, and it is consistently rated one of the top drives in the world. I was able to make it about halfway up the parkway, a bit past the Saskatchewan River crossing, before needing to return to the south and make it to my lodging before dark. If you visit the parks on a motorcycle, this is an absolute must-do route. leisurely ride to the northmost apex of my trip, I turned around with another 150 miles ahead of me to my destination at the Kananaskis Wilderness Hostel. With hopes of passing through the city of Banff and making it to my lodging before nightfall, the trip back south was just as memorable and fulfilling as my trip to the north just hours before. With the changing weather and 100-degree vantage point, every turn seemed as if I was completing it for the first time. I remember being surprised at the speeds of traffic down this iconic highway. I guess, as most of the other motorists were in cars and trucks, they were again more concerned with their destination than with the present breathtaking views in front of them. Ultimately, it worked in my favor, as no speed limits were breached, and it set me on track for making it to my evening stay before cold and darkness set in on these unfamiliar roads. Through the heart of Banff, there are only two main roads to travel. The primary road again is the Canadian Transcontinental Highway 1, with much higher speeds and very few areas to pull off and take in the views around you. Paralleling Highway 1 is Improvement Road 1A, which runs just to the north of Highway 1, for leisurely travel at lower speeds and offering plenty of areas to pull off and take in the views. If you're only traveling through Banff, I'd recommend taking the extra time to hop off the highway and enjoy the slower and more enjoyable Improvement Road 1A. Because I was in a hurry to beat nightfall, I chose to ride the main highway southeast to my lodging and take the more leisurely Highway 1A back up the following morning. Because it would be difficult to plan a trip to Banff National Park and not stop into the city of Banff itself, I turned back early from my journey north to ensure I had time to at the very least ride through and see what the town of Banff had to offer. After all I had taken in that day, I don't believe you would be remiss if you ever rolled through Banff National Forest and skipped on Banff proper. If you do decide to drop in though, you'll need to roll past the iconic Fairmont Banff Springs Resort. You can also get a good vantage of it from the Buffalo Street viewpoint. I stumbled into another little gem I would have to recommend if you find yourself near the golf course. There is an absolutely delightful paved loop through the golf course, intuitively named Golf Course Road. Past the golf course, it splits off into a single road paralleling the Turquoise Bow River. Exiting the golf course, I took advantage of a quick stop at the Bow Falls viewpoint before loading up with some Silver Dragon Chinese food from the heart of Banff proper and barreling down the highway at golden hour to beat the encroaching darkness to the Kananaskis Wilderness Hostel. feel like hostels in the US get a bad rap. Although this was not my first time staying in a hostel, it was my first time staying in the group dorm of a hostel. I did have my reservations, but I figured if I was able to live aboard a submarine, I'd be able to manage sharing a group dorm for one night. At $33 Canadian, this place is an absolute bargain. It was immaculate, the staff was amazing, and it was a real treat to mingle with the locals and foreigners I was sharing the place with. I spent a relaxing evening in a recliner by the fireplace, and besides one late-night noisy chef in the kitchen, I got a perfect night's rest to recharge for my journey back home. I woke up the next morning to a light skiff of snow and the motorcycle covered in frost. I found most of the other guests had not planned to be lodging there that night, but were high up in the mountains the night before and unexpectedly woke up to a foot of snow. As I mentioned, I chose a poor 3 days to be in Banff. I overheard one local say this kind of weather only shows up in August once every 20 years or so, but for me, it only added to my adventure. I got a late start waiting for the frost to thaw and began my trip back home on the 1A to the northwest, stopping in Canmore for a breakfast sandwich and a coffee refill. My stay at the hostel was the first place that I had the time or the means to download some music for the trip, and it made the ride back home all that more enjoyable. I want to thank you for taking the time to let me share my journey with you. If you're contemplating a trip through the Canadian Rocky Mountains yourself, I would encourage you make the commitment. If you can muster the strength to at the very least tickle that like button, it's always appreciated. Or if you'd like YouTube to recommend more of my videos, the best thing you can do to show your interest and appreciation is to subscribe via the button below and keep up to date on my maintenance and adventures. For the trip home, I took the 1A out of Canmore, cut the 93 southwest through the mountain pass, and hopped onto the 95, crossing the border at Eastport before continuing home through Bonner's Ferry and Sandpoint. Here's a little compilation of that. Thanks again for taking the time to participate in my journey. I love having the opportunity to look back on these memories and share them with you, and it always motivates me to continue taking the camera along when my effort is validated through the likes, comments, and subscriptions below. If you have any questions or just want to give a shout out, don't hesitate to get a conversation started in the comments section. A couple small issues came up on the wing, and I plan to review and address them this fall with videos. Until next time, good vibes only.